Welcome to the 1WC interview series, episode 34. The interview series is a production of the Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit 1 Week Critique, which provides pedagogical resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about our programs or support our work by visiting our Patreon page or by going to our website, oneweekcritique.com. That's the number 1weekcritique.com. I'm Adam al-Sirgany. And today I have the pleasure of sitting down with Jaydn DeWald. Jaydn DeWald is the author of the essay collection Sheets of Sound, Broken Seep Press, 2020, a cross-genre book, the Rosebud Variations, also Broken Seep Books, 2021, and several limited edition chapbooks, most recently A Love Supreme, Fragments and Ephemera, winner of the 2019 Quarterly West Chapbook Contest. New work is forthcoming in Annulet, a journal of poetics, Denver Quarterly, Fairy Tale Review, Witness, and other publications. He is an assistant professor of English and director of creative writing at Piedmont University in Demarest, Georgia. Did I get that one right?
You did.
Right. And serves as managing editor for Comp, an interdisciplinary journal. Today, we're going to take an unusual look at some of the rev and rep of Jaydn's poetry series, Evening Sketches, portions of which have been published in Adroit, Diagram, Blue Earth Review, December, and Poet Lore, and have been performed elsewhere. Welcome, Jaydn.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Thanks for coming. Jaydn, I mentioned an unusual look because in the interview series, we usually talk about an early draft of a piece, and then, with scare quotes around it, a final draft or a published draft of a piece. You operate in something I'm not going to incidentally compare to jazz music, with a rev and rep style, which is a Susan Laurie Parks term, the playwright and novelist. First, can I ask you, what does Parks mean by rev and rep, and how have you adapted and shaped that term for your own purposes?
Right. I think she means something really simple with it. It's a shorthand for revision and repetition, a kind of just a hip shorthand for what is really an integral kind of foundational idea in jazz, which is a player repeats a phrase or a melody or whatever, again and again and again, each time with a difference, with variations. Yeah. And so it kind of mutates all the time. I think Laurie Parks in particular is interested in how rev and rep can be integrated into narratives. Yeah. So in order to produce a kind of non-linear dramatization that feels more like a musical score than a series of plot points or something. Yeah. That's really interesting to me, but maybe is less relevant to the series of poems that we're talking about now.
Sure.
Yeah.
Word. So speaking of the series we're talking about now, we're gonna, rather than look at a first draft, last draft, we're gonna look at a couple pieces from the series. They aren't titled, rather they're shape-based and develop around images, sound ideas, word plays, concepts. So I want to come back to all that later. Before we get there, would you mind starting us out by sharing the sketch beginning Music of Sagebrush, which first appeared in gigantic sequins and later made its way into the final essay of Sheets of Sound, which was published last year by Broken Seep.
Music of sagebrush, cold night of nightmares, curtains of winter, long stories of hair, of breathing pianos, black teeth of nightmares, flash o' lightning of swimming and bodies of air, voices of back roads, our shadows of breathing, smoke of twin harps, our shadows of swimming, a bowl of white hair, the monk escapes often, sweat of more sweat, the music of breathing, sagebrush of back roads, the twin harps of swimming, the black teeth of smoke, cold winter of lightning, air of pianos, long night of nightmares, phosphor of oranges, pianos, her hair, black curtains of voices, a white bowl of cold, flash stories of bodies, of breathing back roads, sweat of more sweat, the monk hides despair, flasho nightmares of bodies, of black teeth and stories, twin shadows of lightning, long music of hair.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So Jaydn, these pieces are written after Jack Gilbert, the late great poet of, I mentioned to you, my thinking of him as being a little bit of all categories and no category at all.
Yeah, which I'm interested in.
Yeah.
I would love to hear you explain what you mean by that exactly.
Yeah, I think he, when I read his poems, there's something almost arcane about his approach. If you look at some of his contemporaries, right? Like he doesn't really end up landing into, the beat scene that he's around. He's not, but he does have some of that music or lilt about it. And he's got some of the kind of staunch structure of someone more like Robert Duncan, or without, that almost aggressive academe about it,
It's not quite as pompous, I could say. I love Duncan. Something kind of pompous about him, yeah. Yeah, he does sort of evade categorization.
Yeah.
Jack Gilbert does, yeah.
I'm tying you to Gilbert. When I read these poems for the first time, I'm thinking about Gilbert loves the concrete, I think. Not in that he's like making Christmas trees, which I guess I'm thinking of because it's December right now. But he does like a nice square, which is something that you like a lot and you talk a little bit about in some of your essays. And he likes, I think, a little bit of evasiveness in his way of talking about images. How do you link these poems to Gilbert? What do you?
Right, yeah. Well, Gilbert was very interested in how language, words, could evoke so much. Like Marvin Bell always used to tell me, like, poets use words to get beyond words.
Yeah.
I really feel that when I read Gilbert. There's a particular poem, a well-known poem called The Forgotten Dialect of the Heart, where he discusses that in great detail. And that poem, in fact, became the kind of impetus for using Gilbert's language in this series. So the formal apparatus that I've constructed quite at random over many years has nothing to do with Gilbert. But when I first began to do the poems, which is really a kind of like, let's just plug in words separated by prepositions. I had just happened to have read that poem again, and I had his collected poems at hand. And so I just opened it and I began to plug in Gilbert's words instead of my own. And then, which I saw as paying homage to that idea about, I can, do you mind if I share a poem briefly?
Please.
I'll just read a couple of phrases that I think, the poem's so beautiful, but it's everywhere online. People can read it. Cool. How astonishing it is that language can almost mean, and frightening that it does not quite. Love, we say, God, we say, Rome and Machiko, we write, and the words get it all wrong. We say bread, and it means according to which nation. French has no word for home, and we have no word for strict pleasure, so on and so forth. And then he gets to the bottom, and he says, what we feel most has no name but amber archers, cinnamon horses, and birds. So the poem just sort of like refuses to say something, and it allows the evocations, whatever personal evocations or cultural or historical evocations that might be contained in those words, ambers, archers, cinnamon horses, and birds, just to be there. So I was interested in that idea. If you could just take these whatever words and put them into a poem, like a kind of formal poem that had some music, if they could, readers could map a kind of personal story in their mind, you know?
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just thinking about, you talk a little bit about Harriet Mullen using like a +7 technique, and
Right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
that kind of sense of random and chosenness in the way that the reader interacts with it. It's interesting.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that's probably like one of the most famous Oulipian methods, right? The N+7. You kind of, just for people who don't know, you take an extant poem and then you replace every substantive noun with the seventh noun preceding or in the dictionary, you know? So yeah, it just becomes a game of chance. I guess I'm in some ways indebted to that kind of practice here, but it feels less chance-based.
Yeah.
It's not really an aleatory practice that I'm doing here. I do stuff like that elsewhere, but yeah, there's more deliberation in terms of mood and atmosphere and tone and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Word. Speaking of mood and atmosphere and tone, one of my favorites of these sketches is the one beginning "Flowers in Darkness." Would you mind reading that one for us?
Sure. Okay, yeah, this first appeared in Adroit, and it had like an MP3 of me reading it with some bass. I think we're going to listen to that later, but
Yeah.
all right. Flowers in darkness, trout in sunlight, the basement in ruins, blue clouds in the night, inside the bedroom, bright hair in the sunlight, wrists in silk gloves and dancing in lines, black mirrors in rainstorms, inside the heart, still leaves in the gutters invaded his heart, in the mind a warm breeze, the lovers in shrouded, bringing the gods in silk gloves in tatters, still leaves in rainstorms, incense in lines, wrists in the gutters, the music inside, ruins in bedrooms, trout in the night, disrobing in orchards, the woman alight, black mirrors invaded, in storms a man, blue clouds in the dancing, bright hair in his hands, bring in the gods, the lovers in sunlight, still leaves in black mirrors, silk gloves in the gutters, the music's in tatters, it flowers inside.
Cool. Thank you for reading that. It's interesting to hear the two of these slightly separated, and we will get a chance a little bit later to kind of listen to the music out and think that out. Before we get there, I'm hoping that we can think out, process a little more. I've written to you that there's something about your work that reminds me of what the pianist Kenny Warner describes as random composition, where his suggestion is that if you put any notes onto a staff, you've got something to edit, which is less anxiety producing than looking at a blank page or a blank staff and having to like make up genes. I'm interested in that for a lot of reasons, as it pertains to your work. In part because your poems are, for contemporary poems, very rhyme and repetition abundant. they also have a real sense of fluidity and movement despite that. And on top of that, I think they do what the hardest thing to do is, which is, right, they surprise me, they like take me aback. Werner's technique is kind of a guess at how you're getting to some of that, and in part because of something you say in your essay, Notes from a Comp Teacher's Diary. A lot of things you say in that essay. You've got a, for those of you who are teachers out there, it's a compelling set of insights. But you write, to write well, one must first allow oneself to write poorly. So I'm wondering, how did you begin here? How do you write poorly? How do you get something on the page to be working with? And what brings about sort of unusual and striking conjunctions like flowers in darkness, trout in sunlight? I mean, there is a nature leap there, but there's something else about it, you know?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think your guess is very correct. I mean, I write out of nothing, ex nihilo, or whatever Latin fancy phrase you want to say, all the time, and I love the blank page.
Okay.
But you know, sometimes I call these evening sketches because that's what they are. You know, they feel like etudes or practice or something. And I often do them in the middle of the night after I've like put my kids to sleep or something, and I'm tired, but I want to write, you know?
Yeah.
And so I just let myself kind of riff on this form, and it feels very improvisational. Yeah, so you have the form, and well, I mean, I'll kind of embarrassingly confess how I do it. I copy one that I think is working pretty well, and I paste it into a new document, and then I go to like search and replace, and then and I just start putting in words, you know. And I'm not using Gilbert as much as I used to anymore. In fact, the last few that I've written in the same form and the same method are no longer titled after Jack Gilbert. I found that they got in the way.
Yeah.
Seeming to suggest something about Gilbert or Gilbert's aesthetic that was no longer present in the poems, and it had sort of mutated out of whatever it was at first. Yeah, so I mean, that's how I do it. Okay, but to write well, you must first allow yourself to write poorly.
Yeah.
That's a phrase, my own kind of riff on a phrase that my teacher Marvin Bell used to always tell us. No good stuff without bad stuff. The good stuff we're all part of the stuff. Yeah, people have maybe heard all that many times. The truth is that I use phrases like that all the time with my students because they get it. But I actually don't believe in mistakes. I don't believe that there's bad stuff and that there's good stuff.
Yeah.
And what I try to do is work like a jazz musician, which is to say that you're going in real time. And, you know, a jazz musician plays a mistake. There's no time to register it as such, right? You simply have to move forward. You do something to it, or you ignore it, or you deny it, or whatever, you know? And so I just constantly move, and I view deletion as active and productive a gesture as putting a word on the page.
Yeah.
I view them as the same, you know? And so I mean, it's hard to say like what makes it onto the page is better than what was cut. It just happened to gel in a certain way intuitively, that these words were activating something or echoing something together. But maybe more interesting words and phrases were cut along the way. I don't know, because they're gone. You know. Yeah, I feel like I'm very, very mysterious about this. I should record myself and a time-lapse video of me writing it. But yeah.
No, I like that. I think it makes sense in a kind of immediate way. I had a friend who used to say that the word clams made no sense because in real time it was part of the song, and so you just had to deal with it. Meaning that there are no wrong notes because in the real time of performing in front of people, you just have to make something part of the song in some way or another. So the idea that you'd hit a wrong note is a useless thought. And I think that um, I'm hoping we'll get back to in a little bit, sort of ways in which you do and don't make choices for publication, which ultimately, right? Like there is a page on which you're performing, right?
Yeah, yeah, you're right. I mean, can I put it a different way?
Oh, please.
Um, the late philosopher Levy Brown has a great essay called "Feeling My Way," which is about jazz improvisation, and he's describing and defining really that improvisational arts for non-practitioners.
Yeah.
He uses two concepts that I think are really important. One, he says, like, most art, Western art in particular, is uses a prospective model. This is his term.
Yeah.
Meaning that there's like a kind of holistic conception of the artwork, right? And so that in a painting or a piece of, let's say, classical music or something like that, every decision has been made with all the other decisions in mind, right? So there's this kind of holistic view of it. Whereas improvisational arts like jazz is a retrospective model, meaning that something happens, a random brushstroke or whatever, and then the artist makes decisions based on what just happened and moves forward. And there's no time to erase. And so there is no holistic conception of an artwork. There's only now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Only just doing what you just, it's like a split-second reaction. There's only that.
Yeah.
So to listen to jazz is to be in real time with the music, and so I think you're right in saying that, like, it's difficult to ignore holistic conceptions of poetry because most of the time the entire poem's on the page. You can see it,
Yeah.
whereas like a time-based art like music, you have to wait 3.5 minutes or however long the composition is to get to the end. So I don't want to spell this out too much that I'm a pure improviser or something. I'm not. I mean, David Anton's talk poems, if you've ever watched videos of that, that's real kind of improvisation. I don't do that, but I nonetheless, like, that the practice of improvisation was really deep in my bones. I was doing that way before I even read books. Is really important to how I work, and so I try to maintain a kind of presentness with what's happening and work in that retrospective model. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm excited about that because I think a lot of your thinking, but also a lot of your work is asking people to imagine those other ways of thinking about it and reimagining interactions with a book. I once had a teacher tell me that you should buy a new copy of every book because that is the kind of like money that's going to the artist and a crappy copy of the same book so that you can draw on it and tear it up and like find ways of interacting with it outside of the librarian's sensibility about having that book or the kind of money-making sensibility. Speaking of books in your library and in mine, you're right. It's the worst transition I've ever had. You talk a lot in Sheets of Sound about Kate Chopin. And I think I'm reading way too much into that fact because absent having a lot of silk in my life, I didn't have a lot of it in my childhood. I realized there's never been a time silk has been a thing in my life. That when I see it, I immediately think of her story, A Pair of Silk Stockings, in a more general way though, right? You've told us a little bit about how Gilbert influenced your work. Um, in Sheets of Sound, um, you mentioned that you don't necessarily talk about jazz musicians a lot, but I do see allusions directly or indirectly to, Charlie Parker and John Coltrane, Miles Davis. I also, you know, I'll never see Trout and not think Abroad again. And I do hear musical allusions to Baudelaire and Rimbaud and some of the French surrealists. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, that retrospective look and how that sense of illusion comes into your texts, and why illusion is so important to you? Or
Yeah. Okay. First, let me just say that I love that Kate Chopin interpretation. I mean, I write about her a little bit. I do kind of a queer reading of The Awakening in one of the essays in the book. But I do love that short story. Taught it a number of times. And there isn't silk gloves in it. There's just silk stockings, and then she buys other gloves, But in some ways that it brings to mind exactly what Gilbert, I think, means with language, the evocation of language,
Yeah.
You just saw silk and thought of a pair of silk stockings, You thought Trout and you thought of Richard Brodigan. I've never read Richard Brodigan, which is a total blank spot, Maybe I should. I'll get some recs after this interview.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's really interesting to me that you can kind of map stuff onto the poems. That pleases me. Yeah. In terms of references, well, there's a monk in a couple of these poems. It's obviously a lowercase monk, but for me, that always evokes the Thelonious Monk, of course. Oh God, I mean, there's just references everywhere in my work. I don't know how to think without making references or allusions. I mean, they're like artists and artworks are just always at the ready, I mean, but one of the great things about critical writing, and one of the things I really loved about writing Sheets of Sound was even the title's a reference to a phrase that was used to describe Coltrane's solos, Sheets of Sound, But anyway, one of the things I love about critical writing is you can say, like, you can bring in Ellen Douglas and Nicole Mitchell and, I don't know, Kate Chopin, you can bring all those things do not belong together, except that I love them, and so that in my own personal Rolodex of associations and references, they're there. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, can I share something?
Yeah, please.
Which is maybe a slightly tangential to what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is, I write about a little bit about this in the book. This is an illustration from chapter 17 of Huck Finn, where Huck is kind of staying briefly at the Grangerfords, and one of the daughters, Emmeline Grangerford, was a kind of amateur artist, and she had died. And apparently she died before she got to finish this drawing. She was trying out different ways of putting this woman's hands, right? She's in a nightgown on this railing. Maybe she's going to jump. Maybe she's going to pray to the moon. I have no idea. So all these possible versions of this drawing are together, right? And that little caption, it made her look too spidery, is something that Huck says. But I always loved the spideriness of it, right? So obviously this brings to mind like the rep and rev tradition, working with variations, but also I think this is how references and allusions work when you're writing, that you have that one bit of language is gesturing toward a historical period or a cultural artifact that is important to you and important to others. Another one is working with something very private about your experience. And so, I mean, it's got its spidery arms all over the place, you know?
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting to kind of map each artist's like reference, what they think about when they're writing. I don't know, but yeah, that's how I see it. So that the work is always partly private and individual, and also like belongs to, you know, historical moments and you know, cultural artifacts and aesthetic traditions and all that stuff, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by that for a million reasons, including, right, like the example you give of the pianist Thelonious Monk.
Mhm.
Um, because I came to your work at first, a friend or a mutual friend had recommended your
Mhm.
work to me. When I see Monk, I go to jazz music and I go to Thelonious Monk. And I have a whole set of associations in my head of what Monk sounds like. And I actually shared some of your poems with one of my roommates who immediately went to um, Chekhov and Chekhov, a Chekhov story about a monk. I think it's called The Black Monk, maybe Death of a
Mhm.
Monk. I'm going to forget, so I'm not going to try to get it right. And I went back and I did look at that poem and realized that there weren't so many associations involved there that if I didn't know something about you, I would have necessarily gone to Thelonious Monk and gone, that's got to be that monk in that lowercase m way.
Right.
And I think that is this incredible interaction that I'm forced to think about a little bit uh,
Mhm.
as I read through your book and as I read through your poems, and I have to negotiate how much I'm bringing to the page and how much exists on the page, and letting that be a good thing is a good thing.
Right. Yeah.
Um, to that end, you talk a little bit in Sheets of Sound about the shapes of your work, your uh,
Mhm.
periodic obsession with rectangles on the page. Actually, the poems we're looking at today move. I told you they kind of remind me of schools of fish because they move
Right.
across the page a little bit,
Uh,
which aesthetically is really interesting, but also because you break within those lines,
mhm.
um, doesn't necessarily show as much as one might think about how to read the line, including in the fact that you frequently break words off 10,
Mhm.
for example. Um, when I hear you read those lines with breaks, um, you read that space.
Right.
So I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about how are you thinking about shape of the poem, but also how are you thinking about shape of the poem in relation to the lines and how those lines are spaced out.
Yeah.
I'm sure this is really irritating to anyone who's watching me, just like my answer. Uh,
It, um, that's a great question. I don't. I'm stuck on traditional lines. I don't know exactly. I mean, do you mean like I don't know, a line of iambic pentameter or something like that, or do you mean lines without the caesuras and the virgules and all those
yeah,
more?
I, I guess I'm thinking of the line as a unit of meaning. Actually,
Yeah.
I realized that it was an exact way of explaining it. Like that, one thing that's interesting about your lines to me is that because they move across the page with spaces in them, I have to think about more units of meaning within the context of the shapes you've created. So there's the line that is in this given row. I'm going across the page, and there's a certain meaning or set of meanings and associative meanings of everything that goes left to right in that row.
Right.
And then there's every individual unit of these poems that is, trout in sunlight,
Right.
broken apart. And then, right, that example I used of off 10 is actually ending a line as row on the word of, then broken again. So I think what you've done is create more than a usual number. While the poems have a sort of strictness in shape that feels older school, for lack of a better immediate term, the number and the plurality of the fractures creates a demand for maybe a more intensive read in the sense of meaning, even as the music sort of flows forward at a sort of measured jaunt.
Yeah, I get what you mean now. Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I think about the unit of composition is word, preposition, word.
Yeah.
And everything is I just do that, for a while, and then and like I said before, I forgive me, there's something very embarrassing about saying I copy and paste a version of but like, I'm just being honest, like that's how I do these. So so usually it begins with the form of another one that came before it. But really what I'm trying to do is, both make it new and pay homage to the sequence, and so there's a real desire to make the poem look different, because if it looks different, then it sounds different. At least that's my feeling, right? That even if you have 5 caessuras in a line, those caessuras have way less weight. And so that I think the reader just would naturally pause fewer, and like the pauses would be shorter, or something like that, yeah. So like the first one that I read, The Music of Sagebrush, is actually, it's double spaced and it's centered, which is very unusual. It's the only centered poem I've ever had, right? I think Gilbert has a centered poem that I was kind of looking at. But hard to do a centered poem. Whenever my students turn in centered poetry, I always go, nothing wrong with that, but you have to deal with a tradition of very bad centered poems. Anyway, but I got one in the books. Yeah. So all right. Well, can I share something else? This might have give us a sense of what how I write a little bit in this way. Okay.
Cool.
Okay, so I did this very quickly. This is kind of like a color-coded rhymes scheme. It's really more like sound patterning, right? So what I think about is like, if you just pay more attention to, like ik, ins, win, is, twin, ten, if you pay attention to those little sounds within language, then it totally makes sense to break words. Like often right there, or and then once you do something once, then I feel like, okay, that gives you license to do it multiple times. If you like, if nightmares, broken in the way that it is, was the only word that was broken in that way, would stand out. So maybe this is so basic that I don't even need to say it, but and the Virgils, which is am I saying that right? These fancy, the backslash.
Yeah, I think that's how you say it, but I'm being wrong.
So that's kind of another way I'm not really using traditional punctuation here, so I'm kind of resorting to other the virgule, the caesura, or there's one colon, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, and it works to me as kind of a loose musical notation. There's a slight pause
Yeah.
there. Um, yeah. So I don't know if I'm exactly answering your question.
No, I think you are. In the like you're sharing a lot actually about how you're thinking about the way in which the words work and interact, but also I think the more we're talking about this, the more I'm learning just how you're thinking about words operating. And
Mm,
now I'm gonna constantly think back to sort of Jack Gilbert's sense of meanings um, within the context of this, but it's also, I think fascinating to me to look at this color coded. Um, actually, John Riccio monthly puts up on our website a review of we call them teaching takeaways, and he puts up
yeah.
um, a poem and breaks it down and how it operates, and it's often very much thinking through what the words within the poem do. But he's done a few of these color codings, and I hadn't thought about your poem in that way, despite thinking a lot about the music of your poems. And so there's something even to think out. For whatever reason, I never think of ing as having that E sound to it. So just looking at that flow on the page, um, the ing is sort of just an extra syllable to me or something. Uh, and it's a little bit of a music that I'm ignoring in some ways. So I think it's cool to see how that flows, and also how it moves and the colors sort of interact, sort of looking at black flash flash and how that comes with back being more
Mhm.
vertically located in ways that are teaching me to read that poem a little bit and see that poem in terms of shape in a new way.
Yeah, I don't know if any of this is interesting or useful, but um, I in some ways I learned how because I don't think about this really very much when I write.
Yeah.
Like I'm not color coding this shit when I'm writing. I did this very quickly,
Yeah.
and I just as a kind of exercise. But
Yeah.
one of the things that typifies the form is that it's really like you can see it here: mares, hares, mares, breathing, swimming, breathing. So there's kind of a very traditional rhyme scheme, and at the end it goes. There'll be something like, okay, the monk hides despair, flash o' nightmare. So that rhyme comes earlier and then comes back at the end, but is separated by more rhyming in between. So it feels like this weird kind of turn or playing with the form at the end. But the playing with the form is what allowed me to do I don't know if you can see my cursor here when I'm moving it, but to break these words in the way that I did. All that was, I realized like, okay, I need to do something more interesting sonically and in terms of like rhyming here.
Yeah.
And so that's what led to it. Yeah.
No, I think that's cool. It sort of demonstrates something about the intentionality and the almost like the Sestina-esque thing that's going on with
Mhm.
some of those thoughts coming back around, and also how they change over time. Sort of I think a lot of your poems as being secretly sexual or something. They're like, maybe that's because like a couple of them sort of develop off the word breast or something. They sort of develop over time and like move through different ideas of the body, and there's something very tactile about that.
The poet Trong Tran, who's a friend but was a teacher first, he said, Jaydn, you have a very erotic relationship to. Um, and I think I know what he meant. I mean, like, I love word. Like, I could just want to rip a word off a poem, and put it in my mouth. Yeah, I really do. I don't know if my poems are sexual or anything, but But I think you're right that it is a very sensory experience for me. And one of the things that, like when I decided to kind of reallocate my artistic energies from music to writing, one of the things that was important that I preserve was a sensuous relationship with the material,
Yeah, yeah.
this language, because musicians know this. I mean, like, you feel the reed in your mouth, you feel the string vibrate under your fingers, and decisions as an artist are based on the way they feel, you
Yeah.
know. And we don't talk about that very often in poetry. Maybe we talk sometimes about mouthfeel or something like that, but yeah, but you're right. I'm always trying to accentuate the tactility and sensuousness of language.
Yeah, I think it's hard to read your poems, and I think some poems sub-vocalize better than others, and your poems are hard to not, they're hard for me to sub-vocalize. I'm struggling to tell you why, or anyone else why, but I feel compelled to read all of them out loud, not just in my head out loud. To that end, and the sensuousness of your work, right, I think it does help to feel some of that out and how some of this music relates for you. You mentioned that you're a little unhappy with this recording, or that it's less high quality than you would want it to be, but I'm hoping we can have a listen to Flowers and Darkness as a recording.
Flowers and darkness, drought and sunlight, the basement in ruins, blue clouds in the night. Inside the bedroom, bright hair in sunlight, wrists in silk gloves, and dancing in lines. Black mirrors in rainstorms, inside the heart. Still leaves in the gutters in faded his heart. In the mind a warm breeze, the lovers in shrouded, bring in the gods, and silk gloves in tatters. Still leaves in rainstorms, incense in lines. Wrists in the gutters, the music inside. Ruins in bedrooms, trout in the night. Disrobing in orchards, the woman alight. Black mirrors invaded, in storms a man. Blue clouds in the dancing, bright hair in his hands. Bring in the gods, the lovers in sunlight. Still leaves in black mirrors, silk gloves in the gutters. The music's in tatters, it flowers inside.
It was a little sketchy on my end. I don't know if it was a little.
Well, hopefully the recording will be clean over here. Man, I'm still always, the bass is a thing beyond me. So anytime, I think all harmonic instruments are a little beyond me, and anyway, it's some like harmonics out of the bass.
Do you play tenor, or what do you play?
I played the Barry for, I played
wow.
the alto for a long time. I used to put myself through my first master's degree by skiing on the streets with an alto. It was way easier than the Barry sax. People are very impressed by the size of the Barry.
I love him. I love Barry, man. That's an underrated sax.
Heck yeah, man. I always wanted to be Hammy at Blue, but I never got there. This is why I'm talking about poetry. Speaking of music and literature together, in your book Sheets of Sound, you offer an essay that you call 100 Notes on 3 Albums, which are all combined jazz poetry albums. Number 96 of that list is, for me, all three of these poetry jazz collaborations richly incite private and not so private images capable of uniting us and enlarging our empathy, images in which we see, or rather hear, the vital connections we maintain for one another and that jazz and poetry traditions maintain for themselves across time, images that do indeed fill the air with life, my life, your life, lives that fundamentally contain so many others. Apart from being really eloquently said, I think of that as being a radical statement, in part because musician friends of mine, famously Keith Jarrett, I mentioned to you, I one time heard Larry Oakes play with the poet Lynn Hygenian. And afterwards, he mentioned what a lot of musicians mention, which is that they're, I think often maybe this is a jazz musician's problem in particular, as a live and transitional art, maybe, that it's hard enough to listen, let alone to listen to jazz and then listen to poetry, which has that concreteness on the page, but also is a different thing when heard aloud. But you're very for the possibilities of hearing it, and I like that. I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about several things related to that. I'm interested in some terms you borrow from Ed Pavlich. I'm sorry, I have no idea how to actually say.
Yeah, Pavlich.
Pavlich?
Yeah.
Introspection and interspection, on community as opposed to the individual, and on the challenges of accepting what we lose when we listen, and what we gain from listening anyway.
Lose when we listen. I'm not sure we lose anything when we listen.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I guess there's a visual aspect to poetry too. Maybe that's what you mean.
Yeah.
By the way, I don't think Larry Oakes is wrong. He may be right in many cases that when you listen to great music and great poetry together, like as a poetry jazz collaboration, say, it can be an overwhelming experience. And you're pulled in very different aesthetic traditions and just kind of sonic directions. It can be overwhelming, but even when it, quote unquote, fails, it fails ecstatically, and I'm always for it. Yeah. Well, let me hit like the quotation that you talked about for, and I was thinking a lot about Ed Pavlich's terms. By the way, that comes from an essay called Stormy Weather and the Time of Global Warming. Yep, yeah, that's a fantastic essay. But he talks about introspective traditions and then what he calls the interspective. So introspective is seeing within, introspective is seeing between, right? And it's about mutuality. It's about reaching across spaces. And in many ways, I think about it in the same way that I think about Emmeline Grangerford's Spider-Woman,
Yeah.
And there's a way in which you always feel when you're in the presence of great art, that you're tied to history, you're tied to a private person and a public person, you're tied to historical moments, and a kind of rich interiority, what life feels like on the inside, that kind of thing. Yeah, all that stuff. I feel most alive when I'm with art,
Yeah.
And so I don't really subscribe to any form of art that's just like, all individual or all communal or something like that, you know. I feel like the best political art is very personal, and the very best personal art is very political, for example. So, okay, that was the first part of that question. What was the second part?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think so. Maybe what I mean by what we lose and gain from listening is I'm really interested in how you think out the spaces you want to provide for your students, right?
Mm.
I think there's the obvious visual element when you go to a poetry reading and you hear someone read. You don't see the line breaks, and if they don't read the line breaks of the stage arrows in the way that you would, you're going to experience it differently.
Right.
In the way that if you read privately in a way that the poet didn't intend you to read the line breaks, it's a very different experience, and there can be something disconcerting about reading a poem one way and hearing it read aloud. And I've seen poets try and fix that by putting poems up on a projector so that you see what they're reading, and to try and teach you to read that way. And I've seen, you know, people try and articulate, you know, I just read Louis Zukofsky's A, where I mean, it's not strict musical notation, but it is, the last section of A is musically annotated, at least in the kind of like medieval way, where like suggestions of where sound would be in this kind of polyphonous mess is the word that comes to mind. It's very structured. In that way, I think, like, you know, I can also read a poem and miss a million interpretations of it. I think there is something that you're hitting on, both in the way that you interact with text as a temporary thing, even when it's there, that's invited by reading to hear wrong, but to hear the music of. Right. Invited a little bit by putting two art forms together. That the thing about going to see Larry Oakes play and read with Lynn Hygenian is I can't, like, there are concerts I've been to and I could sing a lick that captivated me. I can't tell you, both because Larry Oakes is very much in the Coltrane tradition and there's lots of sheets of sound in his playing. But also, I can't tell you that much about how he played that night, or much about the poems Lynn Hygenian read that night, but I can tell you about what it felt like as an experience to be there. Which is an extremely long-winded way to say, you seem very much for interacting with those different forms and letting that flow. And I'm interested in hearing you think out where the give and take is and what does and doesn't come into your give and go into your take.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I'm understanding what you're saying now. That's well put. Yeah. Well, we all know that language is its own music and music is its own language. So you put the two together, something you're kind of, you have to they have to lean toward each other, right? And the page, the visual, like that just goes out the window. I mean, and you have to listen suddenly, and read in such a way that you're responding to the music, you know, and vice versa. Like, right, the musicians have to listen. How do they fill the silence or not? You know, I mean, how do they embody in music the emotions, you know, the semantic meaning of a poem, like all those kinds of things. I mean, I sometimes bring my bass to my poetry classes, and I'll just say, okay, today during workshop, everyone has to read while I play bass. And some of them are just like, so confused and like embarrassed to do it. They don't understand how to do it.
Yeah.
Others just like put their head down and read it as though I'm not playing, you know. And occasionally students like really get into it and they start making like what seemed to me like real-time compositional decisions based on what I'm playing, you know, and the poem changes usually. We're talking about poems in draft form, you know.
Yeah.
So, and sometimes they go back to that experience, like their memory of that experience, and they begin to, I'm gonna break these lines differently, right? Because they have a different relationship that comes out of that experience, you know, of, you know, just it opened up something for them, you know. Yeah. It's a hard question to answer, you know.
Yeah.
Or maybe there's not even an answer. We're just kind of interestingly exploring how the two art forms collaborate. But I mean, music and poetry have been around since like, you know, the dawn of time or something,
Yeah.
you know. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, there's something about, I think you explore this in a lot of different ways. There's something about, right, like no one really knows anymore what the Rhapsode's singing, right? Like the Odyssey would have sounded like. But I think there's also something really compelling about, you know, the Rev and Rep are inherent variation in folk forms or in performative work anyway, and you spend some time thinking that out as well with translation, for example, right? Or the exercise you mentioned with your students where you actually have them rewrite sentences over and over and over and work together to rewrite sentences and collaborate on that, which changes that interaction, that community and individual choice thing where I read it this way.
Yeah, that's a great point. It does occur to me that most poets and writers are kind of solo acts, right? They like to work alone. That's maybe why they're a writer. Whereas like one of the things I really miss about writing is collaboration and like a kind of communal performance, you know?
Yeah.
And it is one of the reasons I bring in my bass. It's probably one of the reasons why I love poetry jazz collaborations. And it's why I love like in class group writing assignments, you know.
Yeah.
Because suddenly like their aesthetics are together and they're either working together or they're arguing, and I feel like in both cases it's very productive and fruitful.
Yeah, I think, you know, I read a Jonathan Franzen interview one time where he makes a very big point about writing being for him about shutting it out, right? Like shutting other people out in the alone time that it requires. And I'm not hating on Franzen to say that I think that it does mystify me a little to think that people think of writing in that way. But I do think it's, this is, before we end here, my last pitch for your book, and thinking around teaching, that there is something, by decentralizing who's writing the work, I think there is something that you're onto about the possibilities of work, because the work is always, right, like whether it's through editors or through the process of communicating with friends, or whether you're sitting there feeling bad about yourself while you've written something you think is genius and a workshop is going, no, this is why it sucks. That there's always that collaborative element. I think you make some phenomenal suggestions on how that might begin as a practice within teaching out of another practice that you're interested in and have been engaged with through music, among other art forms.
Yeah. And in some ways, I feel like, thank you for saying that, by the way. Yeah, but I feel like the sketches, that sequence that we've been looking at, is sort of a collaboration with readers too. you know, a lot of work is so sort of emotionally or intellectually demanding that the reader uh, conforms their identity to the work in some ways, you know.
Yeah.
Um, not wholly. I mean, I think that would be problematic, but you know, but the reader brings themselves to the page and invests and empathizes, whatever, you know. But like this sequence, you know, there's not really a lot of like if you asked me what are these poems about, it's very difficult for me to say what they're about. There's not a narrative.
Yeah.
There's just kind of like a lot of like floating imagery, and obviously I believe that they do evoke and they mean something, you know. But I think the collaboration is finished by the reader, and I think what you're talking about with Kate Chopin and Brodigan, like all that stuff is like, that's like you bringing your identity to the associative nature of language, you know. And so, yeah, in some ways, I feel like it's these pieces do that. They are collaborative, you know. They're kind of virtual pieces, and then the reader maps himself onto it or something, you know. I'm not saying anything about the quality of the poem. Like, this is what I hope that the poems do, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the quality is great, as is much of your work, Jaydn. Musical and linguistic and otherwise, editorial. Of those many things, we always end our interviews by asking, where can people find what you're up to? As a teacher, as an editor, as a writer, as a musician,
Right.
you're still gigging a little bit.
I'm not actually. Yeah, I mean, sadly, I'm not. Yeah. So, well, if you're a young writer or poet and you're thinking about enrolling in an undergraduate creative writing program, we'd love to have you at Piedmont University. So you can check out that program. And then I don't know if you dig this conversation, you might like Sheets of Sounds, my essay collection. And then my latest book is The Rosebud Variations, which deals with a lot of the ideas that we're talking about, have talked about today, but is far more narrative in nature. It's a book of poetry and prose. Yeah.
Cool. And then you're also the editor of Comp.
Oh yes,
Interdisciplinary Journal.
Plugging myself. Yeah. I'm also the founding editor of a magazine called Comp, an interdisciplinary journal, which is a publication of Piedmont University's undergraduate creative writing program. And so it's staffed by our lovely, talented students. And what kind of sets us apart, gives us an identity, is that all of our contributors accompany either process notes or like brief author interviews. So it's like when we critique is about how the work gets created and about having conversations around work. Yeah.
Sure. And that's, I think, compajournal.com. Is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right on. Well, Jaydn, thank you for sitting down with us and hashing out evening sketches, man.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. Those were fantastic questions, and I just feel so grateful that someone is, you know, engaged with my work. It's a rarity, you know.
Word.